Hello, wonderful. This is Sarah. And if you have heard me talk about my own stress reset or the importance of stress reset or the importance of stress reset, particularly for continuing high performance, then you have probably heard me talk about Tiffany Toombs, who is a high performance mindset coach. And she calls herself a mindset coach. But she does so much more than that, I mean, it's really resetting your body, resetting your nervous system, resetting from trauma, resetting from stress to prevent burnout, so you can continue to be a high performer. Hello, Tiffany. How are you?
I'm super excited to be here. Thanks.
I'm so glad to connect again. You've already been on 2 podcasts, right?
I
So
think
I
so.
think Yes, well, back when I started forever ago, and we stayed connected since then. So, and Tiffany definitely has her own experience with toxic relationships. So definitely we'll put in
Yes.
the show notes the connection to those two. And one of the reasons I personally chose you, Tiffany, when we did that stress reset work together is because I knew you weren't just going to talk to me about boundaries in regards to stress reset. Because if there's a toxic person encounter in your life, and you're trying to do something to fix it, and then you go to someone and they're like, okay, well, you should set boundaries, you should have distance, you should have this, and you're just like, I've already done that. Right? What else
Yeah.
can I do? And that's really where you come in, right?
Yeah. I mean, stress is like the more that I dive into it, the more I realize it's misunderstood. I put up a post on my social media a couple months ago now, and I said, quitting your job isn't going to be the answer. It's not going to fix your burnout problem. And all these people were like super triggered by it, up in arms, like my job is causing me the stress. And I'm like, that just shows like that people have this profound misunderstanding of how the mind and the body work together. And we tend to have one thing, the relationships or the job or the whatever, that we point the finger at and say all my stress is because of you. But that's just like the straw that broke the camel's back. There's so many other things that are playing in. And so if we just look at the one aspect, and I did this for a long time when I first started coaching, I was a trauma coach. And so I was just here to help people heal trauma. And that's where like the mindset piece came in, was we were just focused on healing the mind, but I didn't realize the impact of the body, or I didn't realize how big of self-sabotage people could get into if we didn't also heal the body along the way. And that, trauma and other stressors in our life just compound everything and totally pulls us back. And I remember when you and I first connected, you were like, I loved your message talking about healing trauma and self-sabotage, but it didn't resonate with me because I'm a high performer, a high achiever. And I didn't think that I was sabotaging myself. But then when I added in the stress piece, more and more people were like, oh, I do that. I do sabotage myself, but it's in a high achiever way, or I'm still making a lot of money, or I'm still getting all the accolades. And so therefore we don't see it as self-sabotage, or we don't see it as maybe even setting ineffective boundaries, right? If your nervous system's in survival mode, you can't set super effective boundaries because you just don't have the ability to go there.
And you can't set boundaries with yourself. I have a friend and she says, if I try to rest or relax, it's like I'm coming out of my skin.
Yeah.
Right. And she's a very high performer. Like she's very successful, but it's like, how long can that go?
And people don't realize, like, they think, oh, well, I get my 2 weeks of vacation a year, or, I'm going to work to a point. I'm not noticing any physical symptoms yet. And people are mind blown when I tell them you can be in a place of being overly stressed, of actually being burnt out for 13 years before you start to see the physical impacts of it. And when the physical impacts hit, the Hashimoto's, the cancer, the liver disease, the thyroid issues, at that point, that's when it becomes so much harder to reverse things. And that's really what I want to stop people from getting to, is I want people to understand you can make millions of dollars, especially in the online world. You can make millions of dollars hustling, but you're still in survival mode. And the more that I look at, some of the gurus that we look up to, I'm like, that person is like wired into this survival mode. And so, yeah, they can make a lot of money, but they're not enjoying it. I think it was Dan Henry a couple months ago. He put up a post about, how he has all this money. He's got the yacht, he's got the house, he can get an invite to almost any party that he wants. But because he hadn't done the inner work, he couldn't actually enjoy the money. And so he was having to, he needed the boat, or he needed the things to make him feel good enough, but he still couldn't fully enjoy them. Right. And this is what we see is people will have the ability to take the vacations and they'll go to these amazing places, but they still can't switch off. They have to have their phone there. They have to be checking emails. They have to be getting on calls. And so these are all signs that you are in this stress addiction, in survival mode. And if you don't start to make changes, you'll be forced to down the road, right? It's a popular meme that people like to share. If you don't prioritize your health, then you'll be forced to prioritize your recovery. But when it comes to actually implementing it, very few people do.
I do, raising my hand now, and Tiffany can attest to this now. Let's talk about kind of our addiction to stress. I think this is not widely known, that we can kind of have that gauge in our body, that we become used to operating in that hypervigilance or that survival mode. And so then when things are calm, or when there is no problem to solve, we can almost like find problems or create problems to get back to that mode of stress.
Yeah. So what happens is our bodies are highly adaptive. And so for most of us, this started in childhood, right? Most of us had some sort of chaos or trauma. We moved a lot. We had parents arguing over money. Your parents were divorced. Parents had emotional, mental health conditions, whatever it is. For me, I came out of the womb with it because my mom was in a toxic relationship with my biological dad when she was pregnant with me. This is a man who was telling her like daily that she was fat, she was ugly, no one would ever want her. She was highly stressed, didn't want to be in that situation anymore, but was pregnant, didn't know, how to get out of it. So I literally like came out of the womb with a stress addiction, because what happens is every time we have a thought, our body releases a series of chemicals, hormones, neurotransmitters, and those cause us to have an emotion and a feeling, which leads us to have more thoughts. So the average person has about 60,000 thoughts a day, and 80% of those are negative. Then when we look at that hormone constantly being pumped out, those stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, they're constantly being pumped out into our body. What happens over time is our body adapts, right? Same way if I go to the gym and I start lifting weights, initially the weight's going to be heavy, but over time it's going to get easier. And then I'm going to need heavier weights. Well, what happens in the body is the same thing. If we're constantly being hit with high doses of cortisol, the body, it's almost like we have this emotional thermostat, and the body will reset the default mode to, okay, this is the amount of stress hormone that I need in order to feel normal, just like any other addiction, right? A smoker, initially they can get a buzz off of one cigarette, and then one becomes two, and then two becomes five, and then five becomes a pack a day. Same with the alcoholic, one drink, two drinks, a whole bottle just to feel normal, or just to feel like they have that baseline. Now, the feelings that come with the stress addiction are going to be different for everybody. So it might not be that you feel stressed out. It could be anxious, right? I saw somebody the other day posting, I have multiple anxiety disorders. And I'm like, you have a stress addiction. Like if you're having, and I'm not saying that anxiety doesn't exist, but this whole, even the studies are showing us that the majority of mental health conditions are related to either poor gut health, which is directly links back to stress addiction, or it's a trauma response. It's how we've adapted to the trauma, to the chaos that we experience. And trauma is a very broad term. And I just want people to know that trauma is not just the war, the physical abuse, the sexual abuse. It's a parent who couldn't meet your needs. You couldn't meet your needs of feeling loved or accepted or safe and secure. So if you have a parent who works a lot, your body may have interpreted that as trauma and created a trauma response to it. So it could be anxiety. It could be the panic attacks. It could be the depression. It could be, I've seen people who are just constantly in a state of confusion and overwhelm, right? They convince themselves they don't know what to do next. And this is probably the most fascinating piece of the coaching industry for me, is that when we're on a call with people, and you've probably experienced this, you're on a call with somebody and they're like, okay, I totally get it. I know what I'm going to do. And then you get off the call, and when you follow up with them the next day or the next week or whatever, they're like, oh, I got totally into overwhelm and I didn't know what to do. Right. And it's because logically they understand, but emotionally their body won't let them go into a place of taking action, because it's like, Linus from Peanuts, we're ripping away his safety blanket. Mm-hmm. We don't know who we are without those feelings.
And I want to point out something that I think I learned from you. It's this really fancy procrastination. Yeah. And in self-sabotage being part of that procrastination. And there's not enough people talking about that. Will you go through your 3 steps for self-sabotage, kind of like when you first notice? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there's 4 stages, and it's actually important to know that when you start to break stress addiction, the withdrawal symptom is self-sabotage. That's actually how we know that we're making progress out of it. That's usually the point where people are like, oh, this coach, this technique, this thing isn't working for me, because they end up back in self-sabotage. But when we have the self-awareness and we become conscious enough to say, oh, I see that I'm repeating this old pattern now. I see that I want to sabotage myself. That's how we know we're coming out of stress addiction. So 4 stages of self-sabotage that we grow through. First one is we don't even realize we're sabotaging ourselves. And for a lot of people, they might be aware of like, oh, I know I sabotage my relationships in this way, or I know I sabotage my diet in this way, but maybe in business or in another area of their life, they don't realize. So you can be at different stages in different areas of your life. Second part is we realize after. We go through the full self-sabotage and then we realize after. And this could be like 10 minutes later, or it could be a year later, or 10 years later. The important part when you're in this second stage is to sit down and say, okay, what happened? What were the triggers that led me to the self-sabotage? What was I thinking? What was I feeling right before? What was the actions? And then we can start to identify the patterns, and we create more self-awareness and consciousness around it. The third stage is we recognize during. So we're like mid self-sabotage, but there's still time to pop things into reverse and like back out of it and save the situation. Again, what was I thinking? What was I feeling? What was leading me into this behavior, so that we can start to notice it earlier, which moves us into stage 4 of we realize beforehand. So it's almost like, and this is how it actually shows up for me. It's like, I see in my mind, I'm coming to like a fork in the road, and I know, okay, if I go this way, which I've done before, I know where I'm going to end up. And my mind is telling me if I take the other way. And our mind is very reactionary, but it's just based on things from the past. And it's like the best soap opera writer. So it'll tell you, oh, but if you go that way, like the world is going to collapse, right? All these bad things are going to happen. But it doesn't, none of those necessarily have to be true, because we don't know what's going to happen when we take a road that we've never taken before. And so when we find that courage and that confidence to say, you know what, this new way might be profoundly uncomfortable for me, but at least I know I'm not going to get what I will get if I go back the other way. I've done this other dance before. I've done this other loop, and it has never served me. And if you can remember the pain or the frustration of what you went through in that time, that helps give you the courage to take the new path and to just see. And this is where we really start to create a new biochemical state in our body, or to create a new normal. So what we're doing when we're breaking stress addiction and we're going through these phases of self-sabotage is coming back to reprogramming that default emotional thermostat in our body, so that we don't need the stress or the chaos to feel normal, but we can find normal in like calm and relaxation. And so, people who in relationships, for example, I hear this all the time. Oh, but there was so much passion in the relationship. And they see that as like the fighting, right? But we're just so passionate. and it's the fight and then like the makeup sex that causes them to think there's great chemistry there, but it's just validating their need for chaos. It's just validating their stress addiction. I see it in business. I had a guy that I talked to a couple months ago, and he said, every time my business starts doing well, I just pick a fight with my wife. When I'm sleeping on the couch that night, I'm like, why can't I leave well enough alone? And so if we're not getting our stress addiction met in one area of our life, we'll find a way somewhere else. We'll like throw the wrench into the cogs somewhere else so that there's always a fire to put out. These are the people who go on vacation. They're like, I'm so excited to just lay by the beach or lay by the pool. And then they can't when they get there until the last 2 days. It's because the body is in that stress addiction.
And this is a hero's journey. I'll talk personally about, my work with Tiffany. And so I went through a situation last summer that I was trying to figure out where my son was going to go to middle school in this whole situation. He's very, 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 very academic. For example, at his school recently, he said, okay, there's 3 groups of people. There's the nerds, which I'm in, obviously. Then there's like the sporty kids. Then there's everybody else. He just wears this badge of loving school. So where he went to school and his kind of identity it was just a huge piece of parenting, a huge piece of his emotional well-being, knowing he could get it's just this like magnitude of decision and stress that had a lot of conflict attached to it. And so I was coming out of that and there was a great outcome. He's at a wonderful school, loves it. But I was coming out of that when I started working with Tiffany. And I knew that my body needed that stress. Maybe that's not the best word. Tiffany may have a way to do it, but my body needed that energy in fight and flight because there was an actual fight. Like my body was doing what it was supposed to. There was an actual fight with some major consequences. So my body had all this energy for the fight, which proved useful. But then my thermostat had gotten really high in like what I was used to being stressed out. I was used to worrying. I was used to having a problem that I absolutely had to solve. And so that's when we started working together in that stress reset. Because I was like, okay, that went well. I really need to put that in my past because I was quite aware that my stress level was here. And Tiffany, I don't know if you know this or not. So it's really fascinating when we did our work together. And so then I felt calm. My husband changed jobs. So I basically took off 3 months. We went on vacation. We had all this, whatever. And then January hit. And I knew from your work that I couldn't self-sabotage. Like I knew the steps. I knew to like back up the truck. I knew to that kind of stuff. And it was crazy that the way my body reacted. January and February, I was more sick than I have ever been in my life. I tested negative for COVID, but I just don't know how I could possibly have been that sick. I got an eye infection where I couldn't see. I fell down the stairs. I couldn't use my hand. And I had an assistant who was familiar with like what I had done with you and the big leap and all this work. And she goes, Sarah, you're about to put this new book out. Your body is going into self-sabotage to do everything in the world it can do to kind of keep you in that comfort zone, which is not comfortable. I say comfort zone in air quotes for the podcast listeners.
I call it the familiar zone. It's where we're familiar.
Thank you. Yes, the current normal. And I just want to say that it is a heroic journey. Like what we're talking about here, if you take this journey, you will zero regrets, right? Zero regrets. I think I've done my future. I've done my weight a great service in not being stressed out and overeating. I have done my children a great service in not getting to the end of my rope and losing it on them. I've done my husband a great service and not picking fights with him to self-sabotage. I've done my clients a great service in the fact that I'm being brave and putting this book out. But it is a hero's journey. Like what we are talking about in this stress reset, you were going to have crazy things pop up that you were like, whoa, are you for real right now? Like, I can't freaking see. Are you kidding? Like, what is happening? But it's a journey that is well worth it.
It's fascinating to me the ways that the body will move us into this like staying stuck mode. And I often call it the quickening, where we're about to go to the next level. We're kind of in this no man's land. We're not who we were before, but we're not quite who we're becoming. And so there's this no man's land, this gray area that's intensely uncomfortable for people. And a lot of people are then aware, like, oh, I notice right now that I'm getting triggered by the tone of voice that my husband's using, or that I want to pick a fight over this thing. And sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. But the way that the body will respond in us getting sick or just, and the two seem totally disconnected. But the thing I love about the stress work is that it helps people see that nothing is ever disconnected. It's always together. And the mind and the body don't act logically ever. And so even though logically we're like, how would me getting so sick and then not being able to see and falling down the stairs relate to me releasing this book? Well, it's you stepping into a whole other identity, a whole new level of being, and the body's not used to that. And so as much as, you know, the body, let me say this a different way. The unconscious mind is kind of made out to be this demon that's working against you, or, you know, the ego. We talk about the ego being this negative thing, but it actually is here to keep you safe. And so when we realize, like, this is just my body responding to keep me safe at the level that I know that I can survive at, then we start to move away from like the I'm broken, I need fixing mentality, which actually just prolongs the whole journey and makes it that much harder. And we can move into self-acceptance and say, okay, my body genuinely loves me, and it's just doing this to give me some time to like, okay, am I taking the right steps forward? It is, and it gives us an opportunity to practice self-compassion and like self-acceptance, which helps us move through things at such a deeper level. And it actually helps us move through the whole stress reset a whole lot faster. But we have to get to that mentality that I'm not broken, right? And society thrives on the Band-Aid fixes. We get like instant gratification from being able to say, okay, here's a drug, here's a pill, here's a thing that's going to take this away, right? And this is what we've seen over the last 2 years. What's the quick fix? How do we get back to normal? But what if the normal is not actually working? What if the normal is like rooted within dysfunction? And what if COVID was the gift for the world for us all to look at things and say, hey, rather than just addressing, like slapping a Band-Aid on everything, what if we were to start to look at the roots of things? Where is this coming from? Like I said, most stress addiction starts in childhood, which is why it's not just about changing a diet. It's not just about changing your exercise routine or your work plan or implementing systems in your business, but it's also about doing that deeper inner work so that we're not carrying around those weeds anymore. And that's what allows us to profoundly make the change and the shifts so that we can go to higher and higher levels. And I genuinely believe that that is the solution to like all the world's problems right now. But we have to be willing to go through that intense discomfort in order to get there, because we have to look at ourselves in a way that we've never looked at ourselves before.
And this week in my life, I was working with my daughter on, I have 2 children who are obviously perfectionists, right? And that's something I'm really conscious of parenting well, because they're just very much perfectionists. So now one thing I do make them do is at the end of every summer, in the summer, I have them do this like little math test through Khan Academy that is like test their, like to make sure they're like on par, with math. And they're both very good at math. So they both are really good at math and like math. And I think this is kind of one of the helpers of making sure they're good at math. It's kind of a parenting choice I've made. Anyway, my daughter, crying, wailing. She missed a question out of 30. And we're talking, she missed one question out of 30 on a overall like grade level, crying. I mean, which is she's very athletic. So she does a lot of things that are already easy for her. And part of the parenting process is like, okay, what happens when you mess up? Like, how do we handle that? Like, what do we do? Like, how do I help you with this process? And she said, oh, I missed a question. And I said, yep, everybody makes mistakes, even grown-ups, and she's heard me say that 100 times. I said, you don't have to be perfect. Do you think I love you any less? This was a conversation we had. And the point being, later that day, this past Tuesday, I missed not one, but 2 appointments for my children. Like, they were little academic things. This thing, I probably sound like I make my kids do that stuff all the time. I really don't. But, there are certain, I feel like there's things I can do to make school easier for them. So I never check their homework. I never, like, school is very easy. And I kind of do some prep work to make sure that when we're in the school year, school's easy, so I do kind of the hard work kind of at the beginning. It's gone pretty well. But anyway, not one, but 2. One for my daughter, one for my son. 2 appointments that day, right? That is not normal for me. That is not, I was just like, I paid for 2 things that my kids, I forgot. It was the first week of summer, trying to get into a new routine. And my daughter, Mom, everybody makes mistakes, even grown-ups. I don't love you any less, and that is the real gift of this stress release work. That is the real gift in 2 ways. One, when she was crying and facing her own frustration of not being perfect, I didn't lose my cool. I didn't react. I showed up and I said, it's okay. You don't have to get them all right. Nothing's going to happen if you miss one. Literally nothing is going to happen. You're okay. This is a safe space for you. And I was not in, it was a very stressful situation. If you ever have a child frustrated and yelling at themselves, they weren't really yelling at me. Very stressful situation, very emotionally triggering. And then it's emotionally triggering to feel like you failed your kids by missing 2 appointments that day, and just, that was this week. And it was very interesting to me, the calm of all of that, like the personal calm, only, first of all, that I was experiencing. And then that my kids were able to mirror back to me when it was like, I was just like, oh man, I can't believe I forgot that. And she's like, it's okay, Mom. Everybody makes mistakes, even grown-ups, and I'm not a perfect parent. I'm sure I'm missing something. But that was a gift. And that's the gift of that stress reset work. Because if you're already triggered, those situations are going to turn into 10s instead of 2s.
Yeah. Parents who can, and this goes beyond just parents. It's leaders, it's business owners, it's influencers, politicians, people who can emotionally self-regulate and not get triggered in the moment. Because ultimately what happens when we're in that survival mode, our bucket of emotions is already full, right? And so what happens is you hear the tone of voice, or you hear the tears, or you hear a certain word, right? There's a specific phrase that triggered my husband for a long time to remember his ex-wife. And so when you hear those things, it triggers that trauma response in the nervous system. Now, our primal brain has tools to deal with that, but our thinking brain, this is the only time, not the only time, but when the thinking brain can become our detriment, is the thinking brain shuts down the primal brain and says, no, I know better than you. Let me handle this. And then the thinking brain will look for the person or the thing in the external environment to blame. And so one thing I tell my clients is that your emotions in the moment are not actually the truth, right? You might feel frustrated, or you might feel uncomfortable that your child's crying or going through this situation, but the intensity of the emotion that you're feeling is not actually just from that moment. It's from the lifetime of emotions that you've been carrying in your nervous system. And if we don't have the tools to let go of that, then we can't, or it becomes profoundly harder to emotionally regulate in that moment. And this is where we see parents who their kids have a tantrum and they don't know how to respond without getting emotionally dysregulated themselves. They go into a state of overstimulation. They start freaking out. They start yelling, right? Especially over the last 2 years, like people have just been way overstimulated with fear and stress and like worst case scenario, the world's going to end, we're all going to die, type messaging. And so when we don't have those tools to emotionally regulate, whether it's our kids, whether it's our spouses, whether it's our employees, our friends, we pick them. The thinking brain goes, it's you. You're crying right now. You use the tone of voice. You said the words. You had the look on your face, right? That's what's triggered me. It's your fault. When really it's our internal state of being that we have to focus on. And so the best gift that we can give anybody, our kids, our spouse, the world around us, is learning how to emotionally regulate ourselves so that we don't go into those overstimulated states. And kids express what parents suppress. So, and I've seen it time and time again. People will send their kids to work with me to get them emotionally regulated, but the parents won't do the work themselves. And I'm like, as long as you are overstimulated, what you're teaching your child is to be overstimulated. But if you can show your child how to navigate those big feelings, especially when they're younger, right? Especially your kids are a little bit older, so they can use some of that logic. But if you've got a toddler, they don't know how to manage those big emotions. And if you get overstimulated by their big emotions, what you're teaching them from a young age is that big emotions overwhelm us. Big emotions overstimulate us. And we deal with it by lashing out, acting out, whatever. But if we can show them, okay, here's how, through breath, through touch, through feeling the emotion, we can come back to an emotionally regulated state and then make a decision about how to respond instead of reacting. Like that is what changes the world. But again, it comes back to, we have to do the inner work. So I'm so glad that you're seeing like the knock-on effect, the ripple effect of your work, because that's a gift like your kids might not even recognize until they're much older, but it's an amazing gift to give them.
And it may be a gift I never recognized, and I'm okay with that too, because I know the difference in times in my life when how I would have handled certain situations and not showing up as the best version of myself. And I know that I know in my work, there's a lot of language about putting yourself first, and it's always that's a tricky concept for me. But I land well on lead by example, right? Leading your employees by example, leading your kids by example, leading your friends by example, and it's okay if I'm doing the work of not becoming reactive, not self-sabotaging, not carrying around that bucket of stress and making stress addiction my family's normal, my business is normal, my company's normal. That is a gift. So Tiffany, tell people where they can find out more about you.
So I'm on every social media platform. So if you look up Tiffany Toombs, you will find me. I'm most active, I would say, on YouTube, TikTok, and Facebook, putting out a ton of content there, lead magnets and things that people can get some free stuff, some free training to help them start resetting those. But those would be the best places. Social media is definitely where I'm most active.
Awesome. Tiffany, thank you so much for helping us today on our journey to live a little less stressed out. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.